Across Germany, the towers still stand, hundreds of them, squat stone monuments raised to a single man and lit on appointed nights like beacons. Statues of him guard town squares from Hamburg to the Rhine. For more than a century, the figure they honor has carried a title that sounds less like a man than a force of nature, the Iron Chancellor. He is remembered as the lonely genius who forged a nation out of dozens of quarreling states by blood and iron, the founder, the colossus of the 19th century. The monuments tell that story in granite. This film asks a quieter question, not whether he built the nation, but what kind of state he built beneath it, and who was shut outside its walls. This is the man. By the common memory, much of it his own design, he is the Iron Chancellor, the realist of genius who united Germany and then kept the peace of Europe for 20 years. The record in the files tells a harder and more interesting story of a Prussian squire who began as an arch-reactionary and remade himself into a master of pure power politics, who unified the nation from above through 3 wars he himself engineered, and who then spent 2 decades cementing a half-authoritarian order, breaking the Constitution when it suited him, waging a culture war against Catholics, outlawing the Social Democrats, and managing the press. None of this is hidden, and none of it is invented. The skill was real. The question this film follows is not whether the skill existed, but what order it built, and whom that order was built against. Otto von Bismarck was born in 1815 at Schönhausen on the Elbe west of Berlin, into the world of the Prussian land-owning nobility, the Junkers. His father, Ferdinand, was a typical squire of that class, proud of an old name that reached back centuries in the Altmark. But his mother was something else, and the difference would shape him. Wilhelmina Mencken came from the educated middle class. Her own father had served as a cabinet secretary to Frederick the Great, and her family had produced scholars and senior officials. From the father came the pride of caste. From the mother came the sharp intelligence, the taste for rational calculation, and, quietly, the wish to rise beyond the squire world he was born into. By his own later account, he never felt at home in his parents' house. He kept the mother at a distance and loved the father, and carried out of that childhood a lifelong unease with being managed by anyone. It was his mother's ambition that decided his education. At the age of 6, he was sent away to the Plamen School in Berlin, an institution favored by senior officials. By the time the boy arrived, its early reforming spirit had hardened into drill and a coarse nationalism, and the move from the freedom of a country estate to a regime of compulsion fell on him hard. In those years, one trait set that never left him, an unwillingness to bow to authority. He went on to the grammar schools of Berlin, took his school-leaving examination in 1832, and showed himself markedly gifted at languages, if not always industrious. The boy carried 2 inheritances in tension, the caste of the father, the intellect of the mother, and a temperament already resistant to being told what to do. The film keeps both in view, because the man who would later seem the very embodiment of Prussian authority spent his whole life uneasy under anyone's authority but his own. At 17, he went to Göttingen to read law, and read very little of it. He despised the politics of the liberal student fraternities, and joined instead a dueling corps, the Hannovera, where he fought, by the count he kept himself, 26 duels with the saber, and carried a small scar on the bridge of his nose for the rest of his life. History and literature interested him. The law bored him. He finished his degree, entered the Prussian civil service, and could not abide it. Bored in a provincial posting, he ran up gambling debts, chased a string of love affairs across Germany, overstayed a 2-week leave by weeks, and lost his traineeship. He summed up his refusal of the bureaucratic life in a sentence that became famous. He would make music as he saw fit, or none at all. For the better part of a decade, he was a country squire on the family estates in Pomerania, and the role did not fill him. He read philosophy and literature without system, traveled, hunted, and drank, boasting that he could drink his guests under the table with friendly composure. The reputation he earned in those years was not that of a statesman, but of a wild man. The locals called him the Mad Bismarck. Then two things changed him. Through a circle of pietist friends, he met Johanna von Puttkamer, and in 1847 he married her. From that marriage came a settled faith in a personal God and the one steady emotional anchor of his life. And politics found him. Standing in for an absent delegate, he took a seat in the United Diet of 1847 and discovered, almost to his own surprise, an arena that suited his temperament exactly. The thing, he wrote, gripped him far more than he had expected. The mad squire had found his instrument. In that first diet, he made his name as a strict conservative, denying that Prussia's war against Napoleon had been fought for liberal reform at all. When revolution broke out across Germany in 1848, he was among its fiercest opponents, at one point arming peasants on his estate and proposing to march them on Berlin. He helped found the conservative newspaper, known from the cross on its masthead as the Kreuzzeitung, and he became a voice of the ultra-royalist faction. He was, in these years, exactly the reactionary the liberals feared. But even then, a colder instinct was at work beneath the ideology, and it was diplomacy that would draw it out. In 1851, the king sent him to Frankfurt as Prussia's envoy to the Diet of the German Confederation, and there, over 8 years, the arch-conservative quietly became something new. The Confederation was dominated by Austria, and Bismarck refused the junior role Vienna assigned to Prussia. He attacked Austrian pretensions, obstructed the Diet's business, and worked to deny Austria the standing of an equal. Postings to St. Petersburg and then Paris widened his view of the European state system. In these same years, he broke openly with the high conservatives who had been his patrons. When they denounced Napoleon III of France as a usurper and a natural enemy of all crowned heads, Bismarck answered that the legitimacy of a foreign ruler was, to him, beside the point. What mattered in diplomacy was not principle, but the interest of the state. Somewhere in those years, his conservatism detached itself from principle and reattached itself to power. He had defended, in a celebrated speech, the cold doctrine beneath everything that followed. The only sound basis for a great state, he argued, was not romance, but state self-interest. It was beneath the dignity of a great state to fight for a cause that was not its own. The old conservatives, who had prized legitimacy and principle, now saw him as an egoist and an opportunist. They were not wrong about the change. They were wrong to think it made him weaker. In 1862, Prussia was deadlocked. King Wilhelm I wanted to enlarge and reform the army. The liberal majority in Parliament refused to vote the money. Neither side would yield, and the king spoke openly of abdicating. The crisis was, on its surface, a quarrel over money and the length of military service. Underneath, it was a contest over who would rule Prussia, the crown or the parliament. His war minister Roon saw one way out, Bismarck, and summoned him with a telegram in clipped Latin and French. Danger in delay. Make haste. Bismarck crossed Germany by rail, and at the Palace of Babelsberg won the wavering king by offering himself as an absolute, unconditional liegeman, a vassal who would stand by his lord to the last. In return, he secured something extraordinary, a degree of trust and a free hand that reached far beyond a normal minister's. The relationship that began that day would last almost 30 years, and it rested on a single bargain: the king's authority wielded by Bismarck's will. Within weeks, he gave the speech that fixed his reputation for good. The great questions of the day, he told a budget committee, would not be decided by speeches and majority votes, but by iron and blood. He meant it, oddly, as an offer to the national movement. It was heard instead as the announcement of a man who would rule by force, and it sealed his image as a politician of violence. Then he acted the part. He adjourned Parliament and governed for years without a lawful budget, justifying himself with a notorious doctrine, the so-called gap theory, which held that where Crown and Parliament could not agree, the Constitution simply fell silent, and whoever held power must act. To many contemporaries, this was plainly a breach of the Constitution. One liberal answered it in 3 words that have outlived every speech Bismarck made in reply: might before right. To mobilize opinion against the liberals, he was even willing to court their enemies. In 1863, he met several times with Ferdinand Lassalle, a founder of the German labor movement, the very movement he would outlaw 20 years later. When a liberal professor, Rudolf Virchow, attacked him in the chamber, Bismarck challenged him to a duel. Press freedom was abolished in defiance of the Constitution. Liberal officials were dismissed. This is the foundation of the order to come, laid in plain sight. The nation would be built, but Parliament would not rule it. What followed was unification by war, 3 of them in 7 years, each one engineered to leave Prussia stronger. The first came in 1864 over the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. Prussia and Austria together defeated Denmark, and at the storming of the Duple redoubts, the Prussian army won the victory that ended the war. Crucially, this was a war run not by generals, but by the minister. The soldiers' moves were subordinated to Bismarck's political calculation. The Second War, in 1866, turned on Austria itself. At a Crown Council in February of that year, Bismarck talked a reluctant king who shrank from a war between Germans into the confrontation and held him to it through the months that followed. That May, a would-be assassin shot at the Chancellor in a Berlin street and missed. Bismarck isolated Vienna, secured Italy as an ally, and provoked the rupture. The Prussian army, moving by railway and new tactics, won the decisive battle at Königgrätz on the 3rd of July. And here the Realist showed his discipline. The king and the generals, Moltke among them, wanted to march on Vienna and impose a crushing peace. Bismarck overruled them. A humiliated Austria, he reasoned, would be driven into the arms of France and a future war on 2 fronts, so he insisted on lenient terms. Austria ceded no territory to Prussia, but accepted the dissolution of the old Confederation and a new North German Confederation under Prussian leadership. For his victory, Bismarck was voted a gift of $400,000, with which, in 1867, he bought himself the estate of Varzin, a documented enrichment from the state's war, of the kind this series has had cause to note before. He then asked Parliament, in effect, to forgive the years he had governed without a lawful budget. The request split the liberals down the middle and broke their resistance. A new National Liberal Party formed, ready to work with the man it had feared. He had won the war, the peace, and the Parliament in a single stroke. The Constitution he then wrote for the new Union of the North, and which carried over, in its essentials, into the Empire of 1871, bore his stamp directly. It granted a parliament elected by universal male suffrage, yet arranged that neither the Chancellor nor his ministers could be brought down by that parliament's vote. The forms of democracy were there. The substance of power was not. The Third War he engineered most deliberately of all. In 1870, a dispute over a Hohenzollern candidate for the Spanish throne gave him his opening. The king, taking the waters at Bad Ems, was pressed by the French ambassador for a humiliating guarantee, refused him politely, and wired an account of the meeting to Berlin. Bismarck took that internal telegram and edited it, cutting it, sharpening it, into a short press release whose tone was now a curt rebuff. Published that evening, it read in Germany as an insult to the king, and in France as an insult to France. Within days, France declared war. As Bismarck had calculated, the French declaration brought the southern German states in on Prussia's side, and the war became the final act of unification. On the 18th of January 1871, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, Wilhelm I was proclaimed German emperor. The empire Bismarck had pursued for a decade existed at last, proclaimed not in a German parliament, but in a conquered French palace, under the banners of an army. With the empire founded, Bismarck turned the same will inward. The first great target was the Catholic Church. Roughly a third of the new empire's people were Catholics, and their political party, the Center, would not simply dissolve into the national state he was building. Bismarck cast them as enemies of the Reich, men loyal to a foreign power in Rome, and launched what its supporters proudly called the struggle for civilization, the Kulturkampf. Through the 1870s, a battery of laws, the May Laws, placed the training and appointment of priests under state control, Civil marriage was made compulsory. Religious orders were expelled. When bishops and priests refused to comply, they were fined, imprisoned, and driven from their sees. Whole dioceses were left without leaders. By the height of the campaign, hundreds of parishes stood empty, and several bishops sat in Prussian prisons. It was presented as progress against superstition. It was, in plain terms, the coercion of a religious minority by the power of the state. It failed. Persecution did not break the Catholic community. It hardened it. Bismarck's pressure drove Catholic voters into the arms of the Center Party, whose strength in the Reichstag rose rather than fell, and at its head stood the one parliamentary adversary Bismarck could never wear down. Slowly, the Chancellor was forced to grasp that he could not govern against so large a part of the nation, and from the late 1870s, he quietly dismantled most of the campaign and made his peace with a new pope. The Kulturkampf is among the clearest windows onto the order Bismarck was building, a state that defined its unity by exclusion and reached for coercion first. He had set out to break a minority into loyalty and learned only that a modern nation could not be welded by force alone, a lesson he was about to test a second time on a different enemy. The second enemy was the rising labor movement. As German industry boomed, the Social Democrats grew, and Bismarck saw in them a revolutionary threat to the whole order he had built. In 1878, two attempts on the old emperor's life, neither of them the work of the Social Democrats, gave him the pretext he needed. He pushed through the Anti-Socialist Law, which banned the party's organizations, its meetings, and its press, while leaving its candidates oddly free to sit in the Reichstag. For 12 years, the leading Workers' Party of Germany was, in effect, outlawed in its own country. Meetings were broken up, newspapers seized, organizers driven into exile. And yet, election after election, the banned party's share of the vote kept climbing. This was the stick. But Bismarck understood that repression alone would not hold, and he reached at the same time for something genuinely new. Across the 1880s, he built, piece by piece, the first modern welfare state: health insurance in 1883, accident insurance in 1884, old age and disability insurance in 1889. It was a true innovation, copied across the world in the century that followed, and it is the strongest single claim in his favor. But the histories are clear about the motive, and so is the film. Bismarck did not build it out of compassion. He built it to draw the worker away from the Social Democrats, to bind the laboring man to the state that fed him, and so to drain the revolutionary movement of its support. Carrot and stick were two halves of one design. The welfare state was real, and so was the purpose behind it. Not the worker's dignity, but the worker's loyalty. Abroad, the man who had made the empire by war now devoted himself to keeping the peace, because the empire he had built was the empire he wanted, and any further war could only threaten it. Germany, he said, was a saturated power. For 2 decades, he ran a system of shifting alliances of bewildering complexity, designed above all to keep France isolated and to prevent the coalition that might one day crush Germany between two fronts. At the Congress of Berlin in 1878, called to settle a crisis in the Balkans, he cast himself as the honest broker, the man who wanted nothing for Germany but a stable Europe. He bound the empire to Austria-Hungary in the dual alliance of 1879, reached secretly toward Russia in the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887, and balanced the powers against one another with real and patient skill. For 20 years it held. Europe did not go to war. On colonies, he was, for most of his career, a skeptic. He thought overseas empire a costly distraction from the European balance that was his real concern. But in 1884 and 1885, he turned, briefly and consequentially. He hosted the Berlin Conference, which set the rules by which the European powers carved up Africa among themselves, and under his chancellorship, Germany acquired its first colonies in Southwest Africa, East Africa, Cameroon, Togo, and across the Pacific. The German colonial empire began with him. Here, the film must be exact about time. The most notorious crime of that empire, the genocide of the Herero and Nama peoples in German Southwest Africa, took place between 1904 and 1908, long after Bismarck had left office in 1890 and years after his death in 1898. It cannot be laid at his door. What can be said is narrower and still true. The door was opened on his watch. In 1888, the system that depended on one king began to fail. Wilhelm I died after a reign of nearly 30 years. His son Friedrich, already dying of cancer, reigned 99 days and followed him to the grave. The crown passed to the old emperor's grandson, a young, ambitious, impatient man of 29, Wilhelm II. The new emperor had no intention of being managed by a chancellor 3 times his age. They clashed over everything, over the Anti-Socialist Law, over social policy, over who would actually govern. Bismarck, who had ruled through the trust of one monarch, found he could not command the trust of the next. Behind the personal collision lay a real question of power. The young emperor meant to rule himself, and the constitution Bismarck had written left no place for a chancellor who could not keep his sovereign's confidence. In March 1890, the quarrel ended the only way it could. After a final confrontation, Bismarck submitted his resignation, and the young emperor accepted it. The man who had made the empire was dismissed from it after 28 years in power. A British cartoon caught the moment in an image that outlived every official portrait. An old pilot in a seaman's jersey climbing down the side of a ship while the young emperor watches from the deck, dropping the pilot. It was, in its way, the perfect epitaph for the bargain of 1862. A power that had always depended on a monarch's favor ended the moment the favor was withdrawn. The order Bismarck built to outlast everyone outlasted him at its own head by a single change of king. The empire itself would outlive him by 20 years and end in the ruin of exactly the kind of war, a great war on 2 fronts, that he had spent his life trying to prevent. He went home to Friedrichsruh, near Hamburg, and did not go quietly. For 8 years he played the part of the wounded oracle, a relentless public critic of the successors who had dared to drop the pilot, granting interviews, receiving pilgrims, warning of disaster. And he wrote. His memoirs, thoughts and reminiscences, were among the most widely read books in Germany, and through them he did something few statesmen manage. He composed his own legend while still alive. The arch-realist who had broken the Constitution and outlawed a party arranged himself on the page as the indispensable man, the genius of moderation whose successors could only blunder. For decades afterward, German historians would take that self-portrait largely at its own word, and only after a second catastrophe in the 20th century did they begin to read it against the grain. It is, in its way, the most successful single operation he ever ran. He died on the 30th of July, 1898. What followed his death was not mourning, but worship. A cult rose around his memory, the hundreds of Bismarck towers that still stand on German hills, the statues in every market square, the name fixed to ships and streets, and a whole style of nationalist longing. The Iron Chancellor became less a man than a symbol, invoked by movements he had never known and would not all have welcomed. 2 fragments survived that let the real man briefly through the bronze. A wax cylinder recorded in 1889 on one of Edison's machines, the only surviving recording of his voice, on which the old chancellor recites a student song, and a few flickering film images from his final years. The voice on the cylinder is an old man's, ordinary, almost gentle. The statues outside are 40 feet tall. The gap between the two is the subject of this film. The skill was real. Otto von Bismarck unified a nation that had eluded statesmen for centuries, kept the peace of Europe for 2 decades, and built the first welfare state of the modern world. No honest account can take those things from him. But skill is not innocent, and unity is not the same as freedom. The order he built was unified and authoritarian at once, a nation welded from above by 3 wars, governed in defiance of its own parliament, and held together by defining enemies within: the Catholic in the Kulturkampf, the worker under the Anti-Socialist Law, and the parliament itself, reduced to a chamber that could vote but could not govern. After his death, the idealizing histories made him a saint. After a Second World War, others made him the first link in a chain that ran to Hitler, the author of a German state that could not learn democracy. Newer scholarship rejects both extremes, and so does this film. He was neither the flawless founder of the monuments, nor the cause of a catastrophe that came 40 years after his death. The honest question history asks of him is not whether the order was impressive, it is whose order it was, and whom it was built to shut out.